Donald Trump completes 100 days in office on the 29th of this month, and these 100 days could culminate with a shakeup of the U.S. tax systems. Will he exempt U.S. exports from taxes and go after imports? That's the big question weighing in on the minds of many. CNBC TV 18's Prashant Nair brings us more.
News networks around the world have closely followed US President Donald Trump on Twitter, and so far he hasn't disappointed. His latest tweet: "Be ready for big tax reform and tax cuts on Wednesday." Many expect Trump to roll out the much-feared border tax adjustment. While most trade economists are quick to list out why protectionism is usually not the best response to deficiencies of globalization, the global ratings firm S&P, in a latest paper, defends the proposed border tax adjustment.
The intellectual foundation for the Republican plan is something called the Destination-Based Cash Flow Tax, or DBCFT, and in other terms, it's been described as border adjustment. There are a lot of provisions to it, but the basic intellectual idea behind it is that you only tax economic activity that goes on in the U.S. As a result of that, you have to tax imports, which are now currently not taxed under the current U.S. corporate tax system, and you don't tax exports, because if you do, then you're not strictly a U.S.-based system. So this has sort of been, I think, quite frankly, twisted a little bit into being portrayed as a tariff. It's not really a tariff.
So will taxing imports drive up the price of goods for the average American?
The value of the dollar should adjust by the size of the corporate tax, which under the Republican plan is 20%. As a result of this, presumably, if you have a 20% stronger dollar, then if you import apparel from India or cars from Mexico or whatever, the stronger dollar against all currencies would adjust, and so the hit on the consumer is not going to be as bad, or maybe won't be anything at all.
But what about America's trading partners, like India, for example?
It is entirely understandable that a country like India, which I know exports a significant amount of items to the U.S., including very heavily on the apparel side, would find this to be very, very troublesome.
In the 1930s, U.S. exports and imports fell by roughly 2/3 as the effective U.S. tariff rate rose from 14% to 20%, and world trade fell by 1/3. How will the tax changes pass muster with organizations like the WTO?
You know, the WTO may have rules, but they can be sometimes selective in how they enforce them. So if the U.S. went to a corporate tax system that made a lot more sense, and it certainly does make a lot more sense on just a logical basis than what we have now. If they went to that kind of a system, would the WTO necessarily go after the DBCFT on the labor inclusion basis? We don't know.
Reciprocity and retaliation are major features of international trade relations. Trump and his team would do well to remember this warning by the OECD. A permanent 10% rise in trade costs can lower global GDP by roughly 1% in the medium term. In Mumbai, this is Prashant Nair.